the Korean Mafia boss was about to say, "I do," in the silent sanctuary of the cathedral, and shockingly a poor black beggar shouted from the church entrance. The woman's scream ripped through the air of the high society whetting like a jagged blade through silk. Raw and defiant, the sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings, causing every diamond-clad guest in the pews to freeze, their heads turning in a wave of collective shock and disgust toward the source of the intrusion. But no one dared to move or call for security. Not while they looked at the man standing at the altar. Hang Min-Jie stood with a spine like tempered steel, his sharp, angular jawline set so firmly it looked carved from stone. His bespoke tuxedo, which usually broadcast his absolute authority, now seemed to press against him like a leaden weight. The distinct black ink of the dragon tattoo wrapped around the left side of his neck, creeping upward toward his ear. A mark of a lethal legacy that commanded blood and silence. Those marks of power, however, offered no protection against the chilling conviction in the stranger's voice. His narrow, intense eyes, usually cold and unreadable, fixed on the woman with a flicker of something foreign, paralyzing shock. He didn't know this woman, yet her presence felt like a ghost walking over his father's grave. The woman at the door, Naana, stood in her tattered, dust-stained coat. She was a sturdy, unwavering figure, her wide emotive eyes locked onto his with a terrifying intensity. She didn't look like a woman seeking alms, she looked like a woman holding a detonator. In her hand she held up a weathered gold signet ring, his father's ring, which had been missing since the day he died. Hang Min-Jie, the most feared strategist in the Seoul syndicate, felt a cold sweat break beneath his collar. He didn't know her name, and he didn't know her story, but the sight of that ring in the hands of a stranger paralyzed him. "Sir?" his lead bodyguard whispered, his hand hovering near his concealed weapon, his voice low and lethal. "She's a nobody. Just a stray. Give the word and we'll clear the doorway." Min-Jie didn't blink. He looked at the ring, then at the beggar, who dared to challenge a god. "No," he commanded, his voice like silk-covered steel. "Bring her to me."
Enjoying the story so far? Then like, comment, share, and subscribe now. Now back to the cinema.
The safe house was a claustrophobic basement beneath a shuttered tailor shop, smelling of cedar and old paper. Outside, the sirens of the Seo-rin family's security detail wailed through the Seoul night, but inside, the silence was suffocating. Hang Min-Jie stood by the reinforced door, his fingers trembling as he traced the golden signet ring he had taken from the woman at the cathedral. It was his father's ring, the one rumored to have been buried with him. "Talk," Min-Jie commanded, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the monitors displaying the empty alleyway above. "You have exactly 1 minute before I decide you're a hallucination or a target." Naana sat on a wooden crate, her sturdy frame finally yielding to a shiver. She pulled her tattered coat tighter, her expressive face softening as she looked at him. "Your father didn't die in that hospital, Min-Jie." "Not at first." Min-Jie turned, his narrow eyes flashing with a mix of fury and fear. "My father died of a heart attack in the VIP wing of the Seoul Medical Center. I saw the body. You saw what they wanted you to see," Naana countered, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. "Before the heart attack, your father knew he was being slowly poisoned by the very family you almost married into today. He fled to a private clinic in the countryside, hiding under a false name. I was his nurse for those 6 months. I was the one who changed his bandages, the one who listened to him scream in the night, and the one who held his hand when he spoke of the son he had raised to be a weapon." The air in the room seemed to thin. Min-Jie stepped closer, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over her. "You're lying. A black woman from the streets of Itaewon? Why would he trust you?" "Because I was the only one who didn't know who he was until it was too late," she said, her wide, emotive eyes filling with tears. "To me, he wasn't a great dragon. He was just a dying man named Mr. Kim who loved jasmine tea and regretted every life he'd ever taken. He told me that if he ever went back, they would finish the job. He gave me that ring and the blue seal, the true will, and told me to run if he didn't return from a final meeting with Seo-rin's father. A heavy thud echoed from the ceiling above, the sound of a boot hitting floorboards. Min-Jie froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of the blade hidden beneath his tuxedo jacket. The beggar wasn't a threat, she was a witness to a murder he had called an accident for 3 years. The blue seal, Min-Jie whispered, the gravity of her words sinking in. Where is it? Naana looked toward the stairs as the sound of splintering would reach their ears. It's not here, she whispered, her face etched with sudden terror. And they're here for it. The heavy thud from above wasn't just a warning, it was a death knell. Min-Jie reacted with the predatory grace of a man born to violence, extinguishing the single overhead bulb and pulling Naana into the shadow of a heavy steel shelving unit. The basement plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness, broken only by the thin slivers of moonlight filtering through the street-level vents. Don't breathe, he hissed against her ear. He could feel the frantic rhythm of her heart against his arm, a stark contrast to his own cold, rhythmic pulse. Above them, the floorboards groaned under the weight of multiple men. Muffled commands in Korean drifted down, the voices of Seo-rin's elite recovery team. You said it wasn't here, Min-Jie whispered, his hand tightening on the hilt of his blade. If they find us and I don't have that seal, we are both dead before dawn. Naana's breathing hitched, but she didn't crumble. With a trembling hand, she reached into the sturdy, hidden lining of her tattered coat. She didn't pull out a document or a scroll. Instead, she pressed a small, cold object into Min-Jie's palm. It was a digital recorder, scarred and ancient, taped to a vial of dark, amber liquid. The blue seal isn't just a paper, Min-Jie, she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. It's a confession. And that vial. That is the last of the tea your father was drinking the night he collapsed. I saved it. I knew the doctors were lying when they refused to run a toxicology report. Min-Jie's thumb brushed the glass of the vial. His father's life, reduced to a few drops of bitter evidence. He clicked the play button on the recorder, keeping the volume so low he had to press it against his jawline to hear. The voice that emerged was raspy, hollowed out by pain, but unmistakably the elder Hang's. Min-Jie. If you are hearing this, the snake has already bitten. Seo-rin's father, he didn't want a merger. He wanted a takeover. They have been feeding me digitalis for months. My heart is failing, but my eyes are finally open. Do not marry the daughter. The alliance is a shroud for your coffin. The recording cut into static as a thunderous crash erupted at the top of the stairs. The basement door was kicked off its hinges, and a tactical light swept across the room, cutting through the shadows like a searchlight. Hang Min-Jie! A voice boomed, his own second in command. The bride is waiting. Bring the woman and the evidence, and perhaps she will let you live to see the sunrise. Min-Jie looked at Naana. The beggar had given him the truth, but in doing so, she had painted a target on her chest that no Mafia armor could protect. He tucked the vial and recorder into his tuxedo and stood up, stepping into the path of the light. Tell Seo-rin she missed a spot, Min-Jie said, his narrow eyes glowing with a lethal, new purpose. The wedding is over. The war has just begun. As the first flashbang grenade rolled down the stairs, Min-Jie grabbed Naana and lunged toward the narrow coal chute at the back of the cellar. They had the evidence, but they were now the most wanted fugitives in the country. The flashbang detonated with a blinding white roar, but Min-Jie had already shoved Naana into the coal chute. They tumbled into the grit and grease of the narrow passage just as the cellar above was swallowed by fire and lead. Miles away, in the plush, candlelit sanctuary of the cathedral, the air had curdled. The guests had been ushered out by men in tactical gear, leaving only the scent of abandoned lilies and the cold shimmer of expensive silk. Seo-rin stood alone at the altar, her white lace veil pushed back to reveal a face that no longer resembled a porcelain doll. The softness was gone, replaced by a terrifying, predatory stillness. Her rounded cheeks, once a sign of youthful beauty, were now pulled tight over a jawline that matched Min-Jie's for lethal intent. She picked up her bridal bouquet, a cluster of white roses, and calmly tore the heads off the stems, one by one. "My lady," a voice echoed through the nave. Her father's lead enforcer stepped into the light, his head bowed. "The safe house was compromised, but they escaped. Min-Jie has the nurse. And we believe he has the recorder." Seo-rin didn't scream. She didn't weep. She simply dropped the mangled flowers onto the marble floor and stepped on them with her satin heel. "The nurse is not a woman," she said, her voice dropping to a register that would have frozen the blood of her father's enemies. "She is an infection. And Min-Jie. Min-Jie is no longer my husband. He is a traitor to the bloodlines." She turned, her curvy frame silhouetted against the stained glass. She reached into the folds of her heavy gown and pulled out a sleek, encrypted satellite phone. With a few sharp taps, she activated a protocol that had been dormant for decades. "This is Seo-rin," she said into the receiver. "Initiate the black eclipse. I want every port blocked, every subway line monitored, and every street camera in Seoul fed into our facial recognition. Label them as high-value terrorists. If they breathe, I want to know the volume of the air they take in." "And the instructions regarding the boss, my lady?" the enforcer asked. Seo-rin's full lips curled into a sickeningly beautiful smile. "He chose a beggar over a queen. Treat him like the trash he has become. Kill the woman in front of him so she is the last thing his narrow eyes ever see. Then bring me his head. I want to place it on the seat he was supposed to take at our wedding feast." As she hung up, the city's digital grid began to flicker and hum. Across Seoul, billboards shifted from advertisements to grainy, high-contrast photos of Min-Jie and Naana. The hunt was no longer a private matter of the underground. The entire city was now a cage, and the bars were closing in. High above the Han River, Min-Jie watched the city lights begin to pulse with a predatory rhythm. He looked at Naana, then at the vial in his hand. The silence was over. The shadows were moving. And the woman he had almost married was no longer waiting for a kiss, she was waiting for his blood. The cold rain of Seoul turned the neon lights into blurred streaks of pink and blue as Min-Jie steered the stolen, nondescript sedan into a forgotten shipping yard near the outskirts of the city. They were ghosts now, moving between the blind spots of Seo-rin's digital dragnet. He killed the engine, and for the first time in hours, the only sound was the rhythmic drumming of water against the rusted metal roof of the car. Min-Jie sat back, his hands still gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. The dragon on his neck seemed to constrict his throat. He felt the weight of the digital recorder in his pocket. The weight of a father's ghost and a legacy built on poisoned tea. "You're shaking," Naana said softly. She wasn't looking at him, but her expressive face was reflected in the dark window. "I don't shake," Min-Jie snapped, though his voice lacked its usual lethal edge. "I calculate. I plan. I survive. You haven't breathed since we left that cathedral," she countered. She reached out, her hand hesitant before resting gently on his forearm. Her touch was warm, a stark contrast to the cold rain and the cold steel he had carried his whole life. "He told me about the boy who used to play the cello. Before the tattoos. Before the war." Min-Jie stiffened, his narrow eyes widening. "He told you about that? He said you had the hands of an artist," Naana whispered, her wide eyes finally meeting his. "He said he was the one who broke your bow and told you that a hang must only hold a blade." He regretted that more than anything, Min-Jie. He saw the man you were supposed to be, the man who felt things deeply, who cared about the rhythm of a song more than the territory of a street. Min-Jie looked down at his hands. He saw the scars, the calluses from years of training, the blood that seemed permanently etched into his skin. For a moment, the image of the ruthless boss shattered, and a hollow, aching loneliness took its place. He wasn't a king. He was a prisoner in a suit of armor his father had forged and his enemies were now trying to melt down. "That boy is dead," Min-Jie said, but his voice broke. "No," Naana said, her voice a sturdy anchor in the dark. He's the one who didn't let those guards shoot me. He's the one who's protecting me right now instead of trading me for his throne back. You aren't your father's weapon anymore, Min-Jie. You're his redemption. The tension in his jaw finally began to crack. He looked at Naana. This woman who had seen the humanity in a monster, and for a fleeting second, the path forward wasn't about revenge, but about being whole. The moment of peace was shattered by the low, ominous vibration of his phone. Not a call, but a proximity alert. A red dot began to pulse on the dashboard's GPS. They found the car, Min-Jie whispered, the cold stone of the boss settling back over his features. And they aren't coming to talk. The red dot on the GPS didn't just pulse, it mocked them. Min-Jie slammed the sedan into gear, the tires screaming against the wet pavement as he fishtailed out of the shipping yard. He didn't need to ask how they had been found. The location was a ghost site, known only to his inner circle, the men he had bled with, the men who swore their lives to the dragon on his neck. Hold on, he commanded, his voice returning to that icy, tactical monotone. Beside him, Naana gripped the door handle, her expressive face tight with terror but her eyes fixed on him, trusting the man she believed was still inside the monster. As they drifted onto the rain-slicked main artery of the city, a black SUV roared from a side street, ramming their rear bumper with a bone-jarring crunch. Then another appeared, flanking them, their high beams reflecting off the deluge of rain like searchlights. Min-Jie checked his rearview mirror and felt a coldness surpass even the winter air. Driving the lead vehicle was Dae-hyun, his blood brother and second in command. The man who had stood beside him at the altar only hours ago was now wearing a headset, his face illuminated by the cold blue glow of a tactical tablet. The betrayal was a physical blow, sharper than any blade. Dae-hyun, Min-Jie hissed, the name tasting like ash. He realized then the depth of Seo-rin's reach. She hadn't just ordered a manhunt, she had bought the loyalty of his own shadow. Min-Jie cut the wheel hard, weaving the sedan through a narrow gap between two delivery trucks. The neon signs of the Gangnam district blurred into a chaotic kaleidoscope of pinks and greens. They were flying through the city at a suicidal pace, the speedometer climbing past 140 kilometers per hour. Bullets began to chew into the trunk of the car, shattering the rear window. Get down! Min-Jie roared as glass rained over them. He knew he couldn't outrun them in a straight line. The SUVs had more power, and the city's smart grid was likely feeding Dae-hyun their every move. He needed to go where the grid couldn't follow. He steered toward the entrance of an underground shopping complex, a labyrinth of concrete pillars and tight turns. Min-Jie, the bridge! Naana screamed, pointing ahead. The Maple Bridge was being sealed. Heavy barricades were sliding into place, and the blue and red lights of a dozen police cruisers, likely under the syndicate's payroll, blocked their escape. They were being funneled. Dae-hyun wasn't trying to kill them yet. He was herding them toward a kill zone where Seo-rin was waiting to witness the end. Min-Jie looked at the digital recorder sitting in the console, then at the sturdy woman beside him. He shifted into a lower gear, the engine roaring in protest. We aren't going to the bridge, he whispered. He didn't brake. He accelerated, aiming the car directly at the concrete embankment of the river walk. Suspense hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as the edge of the world rushed toward them. The sedan vaulted over the embankment, a scream of metal and a splash of freezing Han River water masking their true escape. Min-Jie had used the momentum of the crash to ditch the car in the shallows, dragging Naana through the drainage tunnels he had mapped out years ago as a contingency. They emerged into the night, soaked and shivering, but alive. Min-Jie looked back at the city lights. The black eclipse grid was still hunting for a car that was now at the bottom of the river. They think we're dead or drowning, Min-Jie whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, newfound clarity. He looked at the digital recorder, then at the sturdy woman who had stood by him through the fire. But we aren't running anymore. We're going back to where it began. The cathedral was no longer a place of worship. It was a war room. The white lilies had wilted in the heat of the tactical lights, and the pews had been pushed aside to make room for Seo-rin's enforcers. At the center of the nave, Seo-rin sat on a velvet chair, her wedding gown stained with the dirt of the night, looking like a queen presiding over a massacre. Dae-hyun stood at her side, his head bowed in a show of hollow loyalty. The heavy oak doors didn't groan this time. They were kicked open with a force that sent a crack through the wood. Min-Jie walked down the aisle, his tuxedo torn and drenched, his sharp jawline set in a mask of absolute lethal intent. Beside him, Naana walked with her head held high, her expressive face no longer showing fear, but a righteous, burning anger. The guards leveled their weapons, the red dots of laser sights dancing across Min-Jie's broad chest and the dragon tattoo on his neck. "You came back," Seo-rin said, her voice a purr of pure malice. She stood up, her curvy frame silhouetted against the altar. "I expected you to die in the river, Min-Jie. It would have been more poetic." "I couldn't leave without giving you a wedding present," Min-Jie said, stepping into the center of the circle of guns. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the digital recorder, holding it high. "This cathedral has heard a lot of lies today. It's time for the truth. Kill them," Seo-rin commanded, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Kill them both now." But as Dae-hyun moved to pull his trigger, Min-Jie pressed play. The voice of the elder Hang filled the vaulted ceiling, booming with the authority of a man who had ruled for 40 years. The enforcers hesitated, their fingers freezing on their triggers as they heard their true master's dying confession of betrayal. The air in the cathedral grew heavy, the silence between the words of the recording more dangerous than any bullet. Seo-rin's face contorted, her porcelain mask finally shattering. She realized too late that Min-Jie hadn't come for a fight. He had come to take away the only thing she valued, her power over the men in this room. As the recording reached the final, damning evidence of the poisoning, the guns began to drift away from Min-Jie and toward the woman in the white dress. But Dae-hyun's eyes remained on Min-Jie, his finger tightening on his trigger with a desperate, frantic energy. "The truth doesn't matter if you're dead," Dae-hyun hissed, and the hammer of his gun clicked back. The click of Dae-hyun's hammer was a thunderclap in the cavernous silence of the cathedral. For a heartbeat, time suspended itself. Min-Jie didn't flinch, he didn't even reach for the weapon tucked into his waistband. He simply looked at his oldest friend with a gaze that held more pity than anger. The recording of his father's voice continued to loop in the background, a ghost's plea for a better future, and the weight of 40 years of bloodshed seemed to settle on the marble floor between them. "Do it, Dae-hyun," Min-Jie said, his voice a low, steady anchor. "But know that if you kill me, you are only saving a throne that is already on fire. Look at her." He gestured to Seo-rin, whose face was a mask of frantic, ugly desperation. "Is this the legacy you want to die for? A poisoner's crown?" Dae-hyun's hand trembled. He looked from his boss, the man he had called brother, to the evidence of the elder's murder. The other enforcers had lowered their weapons, their loyalty to the Hang bloodline proving stronger than their fear of the Seo-rin clan. Slowly, with a shuddering breath, Dae-hyun lowered the gun. "I won't kill you," Dae-hyun whispered, his voice cracking. "But the syndicate, it won't survive this." "I know," Min-Jie replied. He turned toward the altar, facing the golden crucifix and the shadowed pews. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for his neck, his fingers tracing the edge of the dragon tattoo. He pulled a heavy, jagged blade from his suit, and without a wince, made a shallow, symbolic cut across the ink. It was the Scar of Release, an ancient and rarely used ritual that signaled the total abdication of a boss. "Today, the Hang Syndicate ends," Min-Jie's voice boomed, echoing into every corner of the cathedral. "The debts are cleared. The territories are dissolved. I am no longer your boss. I am a man who has found the truth, and I am choosing to walk away from the darkness." Seo-rin let out a shrill, hysterical laugh. "You think you can just leave? You think the world will let you be nothing?" Min-Jie didn't answer her. He turned to Naana, who had stood like a pillar of strength behind him. He took her hand, his palms scarred and rough, hers warm and sturdy. The contrast was the most honest thing he had felt in years. He wasn't choosing a kingdom. He was choosing a life. "Let's go," he whispered to her. As they turned to walk toward the exit, the guards parted like the Red Sea, their heads bowed in a final, silent salute to the man who had dared to be merciful. But as they reached the heavy oak doors, a low, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the floor. The sound of blacked-out vans skidding to a halt outside and the heavy boots of a rival family arriving to scavenge the remains of the fallen empire. The exit was blocked, and the night was far from over. The sirens and the rhythmic thumping of the rival vans faded into a ghost of a memory, silenced by the turquoise expanse of the Indian Ocean and the scent of cloves carried on a tropical breeze. The black suit world of Seoul, with its cold steel and poison tea, was thousands of miles and a lifetime away. Here, on the ivory sands of Zanzibar, the only rhythm was the pulse of the tide against the ancient coral stone and the soft, steady breathing of a man who had finally shed his armor. Min-Jie stood on the terrace of a whitewashed villa overlooking the crystalline waters of the Nemba Atoll, his tall, lean frame relaxed in a simple linen shirt. The sharp, angular lines of his face had softened. The narrow eyes that once calculated death now reflected the shimmering gold of the Tanzanian sunset. The dragon tattoo on his neck remained, a faded blue-black memory against his warm skin, but it no longer felt like a noose. It was merely ink on a man who had chosen to be a master of his own soul rather than a slave to a bloodline. Inside the house, the sound of a cello hummed. A low, resonant melody that Min-Jie had begun to practice in the quiet hours of the morning, blending with the distant calls of fishermen in their dhows. It was the sound of the boy he used to be, finally allowed to grow old. Naana stepped out onto the terrace, her sturdy frame draped in a vibrant kanga that caught the island wind. Her expressive face was bright, her wide eyes no longer scanning for exits or assassins. She carried 2 mugs of spiced tea, the ginger and cardamom of the island masking the drink that had once been a symbol of death, now reclaimed as a ritual of peace. She handed one to him, her fingers brushing his scarred palm. "The soil is rich here," she said, her voice a warm, grounding melody that matched the island's soul. "The spices and the fruit, they'll take root by the next rains. We are far from the shadows, Min-Jie." Min-Jie took the tea, drawing in the exotic scent. He looked at Naana, the woman who had shouted him back to life at a church entrance. She was the one who had seen through the boss to the man beneath, and in doing so, she had guided him to this sanctuary where he didn't have to be a monster to be safe. "Far enough," Min-Jie repeated, the word tasting like a promise. He thought of Seo-rin and the syndicate, now likely cannibalizing themselves in the dark of a Seoul winter, but the thought didn't stir his blood. He had left them with the truth, and the truth had set him free. He was no longer a king of shadows. He was a musician, a dreamer, a protector of a small, quiet piece of paradise. He pulled Naana close, resting his chin atop her shoulder-length hair as the dhows sailed toward the horizon. The transformation was complete. The beggar and the traitor were gone, replaced by 2 souls who had found home in the most beautiful corner of the world. As the sun dipped below the Indian Ocean, painting the sky in strokes of violent orange and deep violet, Min-Jie realized that for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He was looking forward. "Welcome home, Min-Jie," Naana whispered. He smiled, a real, unfiltered smile that reached his eyes. "I'm already there."
Now, here are the 3 life lessons from this crime thriller you just enjoyed. Lesson 1. Truth is the only path to real power. Min-Jie spent his life building an empire based on bloodlines and intimidation, but it was a fragile cage. The story teaches that true authority and freedom only come when you confront the uncomfortable truth, even if it means losing your status to gain your soul. Lesson 2. Humanity transcends every barrier. Despite the massive divides of race, social class, and culture, Naana and Min-Jie found a common language through shared grief and the memory of a dying man. It proves that empathy is more powerful than the rigid traditions or prejudices that seek to keep people apart. Lesson 3. Redemption requires letting go. Min-Jie couldn't become the man his father truly wanted him to be until he was willing to walk away from his crown. The story shows that starting over isn't a sign of defeat, but the ultimate act of courage. Sometimes you have to burn your old life to the ground to grow something beautiful.